This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 58 of Here's How. Never again was what we heard after the collapse of 2008. No more financial crashes, no more housing bubbles, no more running the economy just to pump up capital values. Let's take a look at how that's going.
Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast. Make your view heard. Just dial 076 603 5060 and tell the world what you're thinking. Your voicemail may be included in the next podcast. You can find tips on recording your contribution and other ways to contact the show at here'show.ie/call.
I don't like to complain about things. Actually, that's not true. I do complain about things a lot, but generally I like to at least have some semblance of being constructive rather than just saying everything is terrible and there's nothing we can do about it. But with Ireland and Brexit, it's terrible and there's almost nothing we can do about it. Brexit is terrible and it's terrible in lots of detailed and different ways. But let me start by saying what might be right about it. Even if the Brexiteers are wrong about Brexit not harming the British economy, and they are wrong, even if the Brexiteers are wrong about being freed from oppressive EU regulations so that they will now be free to put stuffing in their sofas that will kill them with toxic fumes in a house fire, they will now be free to allow their mobile phone companies to massively overcharge them for checking Facebook when they go on holiday. They'll be free to allow their employers to bully them into working over long hours in dangerous conditions. Even if they're wrong about all of that, and they are wrong, there still might be a case to be made that Brexit was the right thing to do. If you were certain that Brexit would leave every single British person poorer, you could still make an argument that it's the right thing to do in principle. I don't happen to believe that argument, but it's a valid argument to make. In 1941, for example, the United States could have stayed out of the war in Europe, and at that point you could have argued that entering the war would have been an enormous and avoidable cost. Many in the US actually did make that argument, and it's not clear now, and it certainly wasn't clear then, that they were wrong in fact. But they were wrong in principle. Money wasn't the only consideration. And, equally, someone who highly values their view of British sovereignty could say that leaving the EU is the right thing to do regardless of the cost. But they're not making that argument. If you listen to the rhetoric from the arch-Brexiteers, and we had Tory MP Peter Lilly on this podcast a few episodes back, but even if you listen to the ones in the UK cabinet, like Liam Fox and David Davis in particular, they're making a straight-up economic argument. They're saying that Britain will be richer for leaving the EU. I happen to think that that's bonkers. Now, I don't count because I don't have a vote in the UK, but there are millions of people who do have a vote in the UK who seem to believe them, and they have trusted them with their economic future. People like car workers in the northeast of England who rely on free trade exports. People like farmers who rely on EU subsidies and whose exports will be hit with 40% tariffs if Britain crashes out of the EU into WTO rules without a free trade agreement. People who don't want their country rent asunder if the chaos propels Scotland towards independence. And that chaos is a worry for Ireland because our economy is so closely linked with the UK. Put it bluntly, if Liam Fox and David Davis are wrong, or make the wrong decisions in the Brexit negotiations, it's serious for Ireland. Now, maybe they have a very clever and detailed plan up their sleeves. Maybe they have it all thought out, they have a clear strategy that they're not telling us about, and maybe we will see a very smooth transition. Or maybe not. So what are the signs so far? Brexit was triggered last week. We've had years of boasts from UKIP and the hardline wing of the Conservative Party about how the continental European governments will be just queuing up to give the UK whatever they want and ask nothing in return. and how countries like India and China would for some reason want to do preferential trade deals with Britain rather than a trading bloc that is 10 times larger. Well, good luck with that. Trade deals normally take many years, sometimes decades, to negotiate. That's not surprising, they're very complex. Countries have hundreds of interlocking vested interests. Some of those interests have to be sacrificed in favour of others, and when everybody is being very careful in negotiations to make sure that they don't come out worse off, that generates a finely tuned stalemate. So these deals tend to be exquisitely balanced with huge amounts of detail. It literally takes thousands of civil servants decades to do these deals. Now, it might be possible to get a quick deal by simply giving the other side everything they want, but that hardly sounds like a good idea. If Britain is to negotiate many of these deals at once, that's going to take a spectacular level of work from their civil service. It's not at all clear that the civil servants have the staff or resources, or the politicians have the attention span to do that. And remember that they're negotiating the exit from the EU at the same time. They've set up an entire new government department to do that. And they can't just go down the local job centre and put up an ad for a few thousand experienced international negotiators. One thing that people with little experience in business, and I guess the same goes in politics, one thing that you learn very quickly in business is that renegotiation is almost never a good idea. There'll always be some naive idiot who thinks that they got a bad deal and they can get a better one by demanding a renegotiation. And they have always made the same mistake. They think that renegotiation means what I have, I hold, what you have is up for grabs. For some reason, they never seem to realize the obvious, that it's just as likely that the renegotiation will give them a worse deal as a better one. The results of any negotiations tend to reflect the relative power of the parties. Unless there's a major shift in that power, renegotiation really isn't going to change anything. Quite likely, a naive renegotiator will annoy their counterparties into taking a more hostile position and end up worse off. And then there was Gibraltar. The Spanish obviously resent this tiny British colony, and they got a mention written into the EU negotiating brief that they would have a veto over its post-Brexit relationship with the EU. Or perhaps Brussels encouraged them to seek that specific mention. In reality, it's nothing special. All EU countries have a veto on the entire outcome, but the fact that this was specifically mentioned was enough of a red flag to send the British into a tailspin. The British tabloids went into overdrive. Statements were made in high dudgeon. Michael Howard, the former Conservative Party leader, came on Sky News ranting about how Margaret Thatcher sent a fleet to eject the Argentinians from the Falkland Islands. Just one single line in a briefing document that stated the bleeding obvious, and Brussels had every swivel-eyed retired major in the home counties fulminating. It seems that they are even easier to trigger than Donald Trump. It was a signal that the Brexiteers won't be getting everything their own way. It was an easy, simple, obvious ploy. It cost Brussels nothing at all. And it cost the British attention and mental bandwidth that they just don't have to spare. Britain normally punches way above its weight in international affairs. In the coming 2 years, they're going to really need that skill set. So far, it doesn't look like they're putting it to good use.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? If you want your point of view heard, dial 076 603 5060 and leave a contribution for the show. The lines are open 24/7 and you can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
On a Skype line now, I have Tony Groves. He's a financial consultant. He's also the writer of the website Trickstersworld.com, and he writes for Broadsheet.ie as well. Tony, you wrote in a recent column, how can it be that it's not profitable enough for builders to build houses, but still the price of houses are going through the roof and are very unaffordable? Can you answer that question?
Well, I can answer the question, but it's really needs to be broken down into its parts. In terms of there are problems around the actual land, the land banks, and their making it viable.
Mm-hmm.
Some of that is actually being tackled with the policies to implement new strategies and actually tackling the.
That's like making services available, things like that.
Yeah, it's about getting things on the grid, making infrastructure challenges, but that in itself isn't actually making unproductive land, bringing it into stock quickly enough. And the real reason for that is that the any tax on unproductive land has been put off for another couple of years, and like it's due to kick in 2019, but not payable till 2020. And so if you've no incentive to actually make the land productive, why would you if you can continue to sit on land banks?
So when you say you here, you talk about major developers, people who have big land banks around Dublin and the other urban areas.
Well, as I said, there's over 60 hectares in Dublin alone that's been identified as unproductive land, and that's
60 hectares for somebody who's not so good at maths. How many houses would that work out to be?
Well, if you can factor in, I think the estimates were somewhere around the region of 27,000. Now, I'm only going off an estimate, but we were looking at, again, you have to take that in, factor that into the planning permission phases, and then what height restrictions Dublin has, because that's another thing that does need to be tackled, and not being able to go above 3 or 4 stories depending on how close the proximity to the city centre and the likes of that. But you're looking at a substantial requirement, at least 1 year of what would be needed. If you think typically we should be probably building about 24,000 units per year.
Mm-hmm. So to ask a question that goes directly to the heart of the matter, when builders say it's not worth building houses because there's no profit in it, are they telling the truth, or are they lying and just hoping that they will make more profit later?
Well, I mean, everybody wants to make more profit. I think there's an understanding that there is actually profits to be made from building as it stands currently, but we're not talking 2007, 2006 levels of profits. We're talking perhaps more modest profits, and they are kind of saying, well, we're getting very close to the tipping point where we went to the severely unaffordable structure that we had.
You mentioned this scale in your article of how different things are judged to be affordable and unaffordable. This is an international scale. Where does Ireland show up on the scale?
Well, I'd say we're very, very close to tipping into the severely unaffordable as we stand. So we were, as of January, we were literally 0.3% away from where we were at the top of the Celtic Tiger. And how that is basically calculated is they take the industrial wage and divide it by the cost of a house, mm-hmm. and depending upon the multiple of that, you'll know where you fit on the scale. And sadly,
and we're right at the top of the scale.
Yeah, we're below people of some parts of London and your San Franciscos and a couple of these sort of places where Silicon Valley heads want to spend mad money to get just to live close to Silicon Valley. So we're really in that company now, and we don't really belong there.
We don't. And Ireland, I mean, if you look at, for example, population density, Ireland has by a mile the lowest population density, certainly of the EU 15 and of most of the Eastern European countries as well.
Well, there's no question that we haven't tackled any of the opportunities that are there in terms of spreading out the population growth, creating new population centres, making Cork, Limerick into an actual ballast or a counterbalance to Dublin. Those things. I know there's plans now in place for 2020 and all of these things, but like if I can drive from Dublin to Limerick quicker than someone from Cork can drive to Limerick, well, we're a long way from actually making that as an attractive alternative to everything being Dublin centric.
Yeah, there's one saying that I normally go by, which is to say, never ascribe to malice what can adequately be explained by stupidity. In other words, don't believe in conspiracy theories. People are generally just, things go wrong, it's because people are fools rather than evil.
Yeah.
Is that still credible? Do you really think that the government is so stupid that in the thinnest populated country in the EU 15, we have some of the most unaffordable housing, in the company, as you said, of incredibly densely populated areas like the southeast of England?
Well, clearly, I think it's a combination. I agree with you on the lack of malice. I think there's an ideological problem wherein we're tackling this from the perspective of let the market solve it, and then we go and tinker in the market, and self-professed free market people are tinkering in the market to actually make it more profitable, as opposed to let the market find its value. So they're actually going against what they're talking about, and they're not. They're working on the demand side, and they're not working on the supply side. So if you're not going to work on the supply side, you're not going to have proper infrastructure planning, and you're not going to actually develop population centres. So I don't think that that's necessarily a malicious thing. I do think it's ideologically driven, and I do think that in the bubble of developers, banks, and politicians, that there's a convenience of groupthink there that says this is how we've always done things, and maybe the cure for our ills is to do more of what we did the last time, but maybe rather than actually try something different.
Speaking of ideological differences, when John Gormley was the Environment Minister in the Fianna Fáil Green Party coalition, they increased the standards for building particularly apartments, and a certain percentage of apartments had to have dual aspect, and there was an increased minimum size. Builders complained bitterly about this. They said they didn't want to go to the expense of building essentially apartments that somebody would live their life in, and they thought it would be cheaper to build the sort of apartments that you might rent to students for a year or two. Alan Kelly, in the Labour Party Fine Gael coalition that followed that, scrapped those requirements. And that was much to the delight of the builders, and they promised that this would reduce costs, that this would reduce costs and make housing more affordable. Looking at it from, you're a financial expert, looking at it from that point of view, who was right?
Well, realistically, again, from a profit point of view, it's Alan Kelly. Alan Kelly was right in terms of making it more profitable, but in terms of it goes back to the old conversation. Do we live in the economy, or do we live in a society? So if you wanted to build an actual place where people wanted to live, he's clearly wrong. And
but did he have a point in that? Of course, we have to live in a society and live in the built environment rather than live in an economy. But were lesser apartments better than no apartments? And did that work? Did it increase the supply, do you think?
No, it's not really a case of. I don't think it was a case of either or. I think it was a case of actually coming to the market and saying, no, these are the criteria. We actually have firm regulation, and the regulation that actually matters, and reaching an accord, because there are profits to be made in those constructions. But if you look around Dublin city centre, we are getting more of those bloody, as you put it, the student ones that are going up around Dorset Street and Gardner Street now, and they're all they're aimed at the rental market. And then you look at the other apartments that are going up, that are being purchased by REIT funds that are, own tranches, blocks of apartments in developments. And so that all sounds wonderful in theory, that these apartments that were sitting kind of idle or half finished or unfinished are getting completed, and they're becoming they're coming onto the market to increase for renters. But their landlord could be a pension fund in California.
Is there anything wrong with that?
Potentially, yeah.
Is it better than kind of a local guard who kind of bangs on the door at on a Friday evening to collect the rent? Isn't it better to have more professional landlords?
It would be better to have professional landlords in a more dispersed market, not in such a dense area. There's developments in Dublin 9 that are owned nearly entirely by two funds. Now, if the money decides that it's going to China tomorrow, how are we exposed on one development where you have then potentially 127 units hitting the market? Are we back to square one, where all of a sudden anybody who actually has a private held apartment in a certain development is then actually hammered, and we're back into the
But hang on a second here. Should the policy be focused on getting people affordable housing, or should it be focused on guaranteeing the investments of people who are essentially speculating?
Well, from my mind, the policy should purely be. Step one would have been around the rent certainty that they looked at doing that correctly, giving a security of tenure around tenants' rights, and then increasing, and then actually reducing the security and tenure as more properties come to the market. So because what we're playing with a rigged system here at the moment, whereby you have the resources are held up in large volume trades whereby someone is a giant landlord, and they are more or less in control of what the market has to do, as opposed to, well, look, we'll come and say, right, we've limited it to 4% growth, and we want a 5-year tenancy agreement, but we're actually going to give you, we'll give you on the other side, guarantee your returns, and we'll actually increase those as we actually go from producing 17,000 houses up to 24,000 houses. I mean, it's a lack of ambition to say. I think it was only yesterday Simon Coveney said he's hoping something like 70,000 houses over the next 10 years. I mean,
this is 70,000 in total, or for social housing?
No, he said. Oh, he's not talking about social housing. He's talking very little social housing. He's talking about.
So that's a total of 7,000 houses a year. That's not even remotely adequate.
No, it's not close to. It's not close to where we need to be. And even if it was this, that's based on his improvements to infrastructure. He's saying that's what that will free up now.
So the infrastructure improvements alone will add 7,000 a year for 10 years.
Yes, that's his ambition. But I think it's far too short-sighted, because it doesn't include a proper social housing commitment. There's no places like Cabra and Finglas and these places, these corporation developments that became communities and established themselves. And we did all that when we were supposed to be broke. And now today we've more people back at work than ever before. We're down to those levels, and we've more tax coming in than ever before, and yet we can't even produce the bloody rapid build houses that were supposed to go up in Ballymun. All came in overpriced and would have been cheaper to buy. The units that they sold in Charlestown, for example, that went for a song.
You obviously are very critical of successive ministers on this and successive government policies. If I was to wave a magic wand in the morning and make you the minister in charge, what would your first 3 policies be?
My first 3 policies initially I would start with the tax of unproductive land, to bring more land to and I wouldn't be deferring it for another couple of years.
So people who are sitting on empty sites, basically, they don't need the cash and they're getting huge capital appreciation. They would see that there is also a disadvantage as well as an advantage to sitting around doing nothing.
I disincentivize the land that's not actually, it's not productive. You know, that is the central flaw of all our policies, because, you know.
So a tax on unproductive land. Next,
a social housing policy whereby we'll actually commit to building a social housing developments, not exclusively, but we could certainly look at you know, what worked in the past and then looking across the globe for what are the best kind of social mixed use housing policies that did it. And we would go, that would be if you could do those two things alone, mm-hmm. you'd bring, we don't have a deficit of land. We're not overpopulated. Mm-hmm. So those two things alone could get real impact fairly quickly.
Okay. Well, you've given me two, and they're two pretty big ones. Tony Groves, financial consultant and also author of Trickstersworld.com. Thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you very much.
Make your view heard. Dial 076 603 5060 and leave a contribution for the show. You can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
That's almost the end of episode 58 of Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, published on the 5th of March 2017. I have a link to Tony's blog and the article we were discussing in the show notes for this episode on the website. If you can think of a topic that should be covered in a future show, or if you want to suggest someone to include, that could be yourself, then let me know. If you like the podcast, please go on iTunes and give it a rating or even write a nice review. Also, please like the show on Facebook, follow the podcast on Twitter at Here's How Podcast, follow Tony at Trickstersworld, and subscribe to the podcast so new shows automatically come up in your podcast feed. You can use iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, or any other podcast app or software. If you don't know how to do that, there's full instructions, recommendations for free podcast software, and contact details for the show, all at www.here'show.ie. The next show will be uploaded shortly. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. Thank you for listening.